In a women's prison in California, there's an old lady who's serving her time. She's over 70, with shiny, curly blonde hair and a round face that's almost always smiling sweetly. If it weren't for her prisoner uniform, you'd think she was just a regular grandma enjoying her golden years in peace. But don't let that gentle appearance fool you. If you could turn back time over 30 years, you'd see that this woman was once a feared figure across the entire country. She was a cold-blooded killer, a female monster that made headlines. You've got to call her by that chilling name, Angry Betty. Remember, she stormed into her ex-husband's house with a gun, and when the bullets flew, they took the lives of both him and his new wife. What's even scarier is that even after getting arrested, going to court, and facing a life sentence, Betty showed zero remorse. She always had this calm smile on her face, like none of it bothered her. She even coolly said, "If I could turn back time, I definitely would do it again." A bigger bullet was used to send Trung off a few more times, and since then, the nickname Ang Betty has stuck with her for over 3 decades. But strangely enough, after 32 years, there are still a lot of people who rally behind this woman, seeing her as a kind of heroine, someone who dared to do what many wanted but didn't have the guts to. So what turned a proper lady, a devoted wife who used to care deeply for her family, into a cold-blooded killer that terrified the whole country? Behind that calm smile and seemingly empty gaze lies a story. Is that feeling really a heart of stone, or is it hiding unspoken pain? You're following a true crime case where we're diving into the most mysterious cases and thrilling stories. And as usual, before we start unraveling today's mystery, make sure to give us a like and subscribe to support our work. Now, let's rewind to 1965 in Indiana, USA, a time when everything still felt like a beautiful dream. Betty was born in 1948 into a wealthy family. In New York, her dad owned the largest cement factory in the eastern US, and her mom was once Miss New York. After marrying a successful businessman, she became the perfect housewife, raising 6 kids. Betty, the eldest daughter, was treated like a princess. Not only did she inherit her mom's stunning looks with her shiny blonde hair and deep blue eyes, but she also carried the weight of her family's expectations, which boiled down to one thing: marrying a guy from a well-off family to strengthen both their clans. Betty's family is really strict about her future. Even though she had awesome grades and could get into prestigious colleges in New York, she had to follow their plans. She's studying early childhood education at a nearby all-girls school because, well, they think it'll help her teach her future kids. And it doesn't stop there. Her parents are super eager to get her married. They didn't allow her to date before, but as soon as she graduated high school at just 17, they started pushing her to go on blind dates. They even made a list of what they want in a husband. It's pretty clear. First, you've got to come from a wealthy family. Second, you need to go to a top-tier school. And third, your job should be something prestigious like a doctor or a lawyer. But for Betty, she only really cared about the last 2. She even added her own important requirement: he had to be tall and good-looking. During a visit to her cousin in Indiana, Betty was convinced she would meet Dan, a sophomore at a famous college. He was not only tall and handsome but also funny and charming. Just a few minutes of chatting, and this guy had Betty laughing. "Let me introduce myself confidently. I'm almost a doctor, which means I'm on my way to becoming a physician." To anyone sober, this introduction sounds ridiculous, but for a girl like Betty, who's head over heels in love, she believes it wholeheartedly. Not only did she fall for Dan at first sight, but she was also eager to write home to her parents, bragging that she found a talented guy who's about to be a doctor. However, when Betty's parents dug a little deeper, they realized that MDA actually stands for medical. The doctor's assistant isn't a real doctor, and to top it off, Dan's family are immigrants from Iceland. His parents are just regular assembly line workers, and he's got 6 younger siblings. This totally crushed Betty's mom. She couldn't accept her daughter falling for a poor guy. They flew straight to Indiana, dragged Betty back home, and were dead set against the relationship. But for the first time ever, the sweet little girl stood her ground. Betty was a total mess, crying and causing a scene, even going on a hunger strike to force her parents to accept it. After 4 long years, the battle between family and love finally couldn't shake Betty's determination. Her parents cut ties with her, but that didn't bother Betty at all. She was sure she had chosen the right person, despite his tough upbringing. He was incredibly smart and hardworking, and after working as a medical assistant, he passed the entrance exam for the prestigious Harvard Medical School. Betty was over the moon, dreaming about the future of him becoming a famous doctor while she returned to New York in all her glory, causing her parents to regret opposing her love. but she didn't expect that harsh reality would hit before 1969. At 21, Betty and Dan officially got married, and secretly, she was already pregnant with their first child. From that point on, her life took a sharp turn. Once living in a luxurious mansion with a swimming pool and a spacious garden, surrounded by 4 or 5 servants, she now had to move into a cramped, simple apartment. She not only had to worry about grocery shopping and cooking but also face the reality of life. Dan's student salary just barely covers the family's needs, so Betty, who was pregnant at the time, had no choice but to go out and find a job. After a lot of effort, she finally landed a position at a private nursery as a caretaker for 2 and 3-year-olds. Every day, she was busy from morning till night, soothing the little ones, feeding them, playing with them, and changing diapers. By the time she got off work, Betty was completely worn out, her back aching so much she could barely stand, but even when she got home, she still had to keep taking care of things. Betty's husband is always buried in his books, working himself to the bone, but their meager income just isn't enough to make ends meet. When their first daughter, Kim, was born, they couldn't even afford to hire a nanny, let alone rent an apartment with a separate room for her. With no other options, they had to make do with a wardrobe as a nursery. Kim's tiny bed was actually a modified drawer. Betty didn't want to lose her job at the daycare, so she went back to work after having their daughter. At just under 4 months old, she carried the weight of her family on her shoulders for years, enduring countless hardships. Then one day, Betty finally graduated and became a medical intern. She took a deep breath, believing that her life was about to turn a new page. However, a comment from her husband sent her crashing down. He said being a doctor was too tough for him, and he decided to switch to studying law. That shocking news left Betty in disbelief. She thought she had finally escaped the dark tunnel of her struggles. Right now, it feels like there's no way out, but everyone has their own reasons. During his internship at the hospital, he realized that the legal system related to healthcare has too many loopholes. Lawyers defending in medical lawsuits usually don't get the technical side at all, almost like they're reading a foreign language. If there was someone with a medical background and a law degree, they'd definitely be a rare find on the market. Sounds reasonable, but the scores from medical school just can't be transferred over to law. It means Dan will have to start over and study for at least another 3 to 4 years, and on top of that, he still hasn't paid off his student loans from medical school. Now, he's adding more debt, which makes things even more complicated. Betty found out she's pregnant again. Normally, this would be great news, but given their situation, it's like a storm hitting when everything is already chaotic. Still, Dan keeps trying to convince her, painting a picture of a bright future. He tells her if they can just tough it out a few more years until he makes a name for himself, it'll all be worth it. All these sacrifices will be repaid many times over under the high level of brainwashing from her husband, plus the weight of family responsibilities bearing down on her. In the end, Betty shut her eyes and accepted it. No longer living as a pampered lady in a fancy mansion with servants, she now had to work her butt off day and night. Not only did she continue her job at the daycare, but she also took on cleaning jobs in the evenings and on weekends to bring in extra cash. During this time, Betty didn't just have her second daughter, she was also pregnant again, but the baby had just been born. The day has passed, and she blames herself for not taking good care of things, thinking that all the stress she went through made the baby weak. On top of that, the heavy mental pressure pushed Betty into depression, and later, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She constantly battles through panic attacks, but out of fear of losing her job, she has no choice but to take medication to keep her condition in check. As a result, her body started showing signs of stress, like hair loss and looking worn out over the years. In the end, Dan's perseverance paid off. He graduated from Harvard Law School and passed the bar exam. In one of the hardest exams in the world, he quickly landed a job at a well-known law firm in San Diego. It's undeniable that he was truly a genius. The first medical lawsuits he took on were huge successes, helping him gain fame in the field. Within just 2 years, he became a senior partner at the law firm and bought a mansion in a wealthy neighborhood. He also kept his promise to make it up to his wife, and from then on, Betty's life changed completely. She no longer had to work hard just to get by. She just enjoys a laid-back life, waking up late, hitting the spa in the morning, shopping in the afternoon, and partying at night. She has 2 boys now, but this time she has a nanny and a housekeeper taking care of everything. From a woman who had to work hard for every penny, Betty has turned into a high-class lady, mingling with wealthy wives in California's elite. If this keeps up, she might just become the queen of the lawyer wives, even more famous than the Kardashians years down the line. But ironically, just when Betty thought she had reached the peak of happiness, fate cruelly played with her again in 1982. While her career was soaring, Dan decided to open his own law firm. Not only did he attract a large number of clients from his old company, but he also brought along some loyal staff, including a young secretary named Linda. At 21, Linda was a stunning beauty with an alluring appearance. Even though she didn't have a high degree, she had a striking figure, a lovely face, and a sweet smile. Before she started working at the law office, Linda was a flight attendant for Delta Air Lines. With her striking looks and great communication skills, she quickly got assigned as the personal secretary to Dan, assisting him directly with his work. It's interesting to note that if you compare Linda to a young Betty, they really do have quite a resemblance. Both have gorgeous blonde hair, captivating blue eyes, and bright smiles. It seems like Dan is the kind of guy who will always be into girls in their 20s with blonde hair, just like Betty. It's not like it used to be anymore. After having 4 kids, she couldn't keep her slim figure, and signs of aging started to show on her face. You could say he was tired of his wife and needed a younger version to take her place. At first, Betty didn't suspect anything. In fact, she was happy that her husband found a hard-working and skilled secretary. But then she started noticing something odd. Since Lena arrived, he suddenly became unusually busy. It was becoming rare for him to come home on time. Instead, he was always working late. Late meetings and unexpected surprises made Betty's suspicions grow. On Dan's birthday, she decided to surprise him by bringing gifts to his law office. But when she got there, the office was empty, and neither Dan nor Linda was around. The other staff looked awkward, avoiding her gaze like they were hiding a big secret. Feeling uneasy, Betty drove off to search for him, and at a fancy restaurant, she witnessed something that made her heart drop. Betty was livid watching Dan and Linda sitting together, all cozy with dreamy looks and sweet smiles, just like a couple head over heels in love. She gripped her hands tightly, fighting back the rage boiling inside her. She wanted to storm over and expose Dan's two-faced nature right there, but common sense stopped her. No jealousy, no drama. Instead, Betty decided to teach Dan a lesson in her own way. That night, she packed up all of Dan's clothes and shoes neatly and left them right at her door. She really wanted to kick her husband out, hoping Dan would drop to his knees and beg for forgiveness, promising to cut ties with Linda. But she was wrong. That night, Dan came home, saw all his stuff packed up, but he didn't even look surprised or guilty. He didn't bother to say a word or explain anything. He just coolly opened the car door, loaded all his stuff in, and drove straight to Linda's place. Betty watched the whole thing from the window, and in that moment, it felt like 1,000 knives were stabbing her heart, angry, hurt, and in so much pain. All of Betty's feelings mixed together like a raging storm inside her. A week after sitting with her close friends at a tea party, she received a package from an acquaintance. Nervously, she opened it, hoping it would be an apology gift with a letter explaining things. But when she opened the fancy box, what she saw was a divorce paper. The shock of that moment left everyone speechless, and of course, the news spread like wildfire through the high society, becoming the hot topic at every party. Betty was sure her husband had purposely set up this scene to embarrass her in front of their friends. Her anger flared up like a fire with gasoline poured on it, especially when a nosy friend chimed in, "Why don't you just dump all that baggage on them and see if the other woman can handle being alone with all 4 kids?" That pushed Betty over the edge. She jumped in her car and drove to the other woman's house, making the kids wait outside while ignoring the confused looks they were getting. The tearful pleas of the kids made her think this was a lesson her husband and that secretary needed to learn. But the problem was, both Dan and Ms. B were at the law office that day, and those 4 kids were left standing in the sun for over an hour until a passerby noticed and called the cops. By the time Dan found out and rushed to pick up his youngest, the kid was completely exhausted, nearly collapsed from dehydration. This was Betty's biggest mistake. Dan seized this opportunity to hit back hard and quickly prepared his response. "I'm filing a lawsuit against Betty for endangering my kids and asking for full custody before we finalize the divorce. With all the solid evidence we have, the court is likely to rule in my favor, forcing her to leave the mansion where she's lived for the past 3 years. Now, I'm not just losing my husband, I'm also losing my home, my belongings, and my rights to my kids. Watching that homewrecker stroll into my house and blow through money that rightfully belongs to me is driving me insane." Betty, who had her bipolar disorder under control, is now losing it. Things just kept getting worse for her. She couldn't sleep at all and was in a constant state of panic. She fired so many lawyers that not a single one in San Diego would take her case. In the end, she had to hire a lawyer all the way from Los Angeles, over 100 kilometers away. But it wasn't a dream come true. He kept pulling tricks on Betty's lawyer right before court, always coming up with excuses about missing paperwork to delay things. This made Betty's lawyer run around for hours, and on top of that, it was eating into her legal fees. The monk kept track of time but then started to take things into his own hands, selling their mansion for way less than it was worth to a greedy partner. Betty knew this was all a scheme to cut her off from any financial benefits. Frustrated and angry, she decided to take matters into her own hands. One night, she secretly went back to the old house and set it on fire in a fit of rage, intending to burn it all down. But what she didn't realize was that they had installed a new security system, and in no time the police showed up and arrested her. At the scene, Betty was rushed straight to a mental hospital by a socialite. Now, she's just a shadow of her former self, labeled as crazy. Legally, she and Dan were still husband and wife at that time, so she could only leave the hospital if Dan signed the release papers. Of course, Dan wasn't going to miss this chance. He quickly drafted a new divorce agreement where Betty would get $14,000 a month to cover her living expenses, plus the right to visit their kids every other week. She had no choice but to agree, but that meant giving up her rights to custody of the kids and her portion of their assets. At that point, $14,000 a month was more than enough for her to live comfortably. She didn't have to worry about money. Plus, she had just turned 40, so she could definitely start fresh. But then things took a turn that made Betty's anger boil over like never before. By the end of 1988, while the divorce was still ongoing, he was shamelessly down on one knee begging. Linda got married right in the fanciest club in town, and the news even made the front page of my local paper. It was like throwing gas on the fire that was already smoldering inside Betty. She was so furious she could barely hold it together. A few days later, it was Betty's turn to pick up the kids for a visit. When she walked into the kitchen, she saw a freshly baked chocolate cake still warm on the table. In a fit of rage, she took the whole cake upstairs to Dan and Linda's bedroom and smashed it all over their bed sheets. Of course, Linda wasn't backing down. She immediately hit back by using Betty's name and address to order a bunch of weight loss products and anti-aging cream. She even left a note saying, "If you weren't so old and fat, maybe your husband wouldn't cheat." This provocation made Betty lose her cool completely. She tossed aside her lady of the house persona and, right in front of her kids, unleashed a torrent of nasty curses at Linda. But the fallout came a month later when Betty received a check. Betty found out her benefits had been slashed in half, so she immediately went to Dan to figure things out. But Dan just calmly pulled out their divorce agreement and pointed to a little line that Betty had totally overlooked. It said that the person receiving benefits had to stay respectful and friendly with Linda, and if they didn't, they'd lose money. That's when Betty realized she had fallen into a trap. It hit her hard that this was just like the lesson Dan taught the kids about not using bad language. Every time they did, they'd lose some of their pocket money. The only difference was this time it was personal. That amount being deducted isn't just a buck, it's $500 for every insult. It's like getting robbed in broad daylight. But Dan just calmly responds that if she feels it's unfair, she can go ahead and hire a lawyer and sue me. But how could she? She tried hiring a lawyer before, but every time something pissed her off, she'd call up and just let loose. Back then, phones had voicemail recording, so all her rants got saved as evidence. Dan didn't even need to do anything. Take those audio recordings to court, and then deduct Betty's support money line by line. There was even a time when she cursed so much that guy's entire support money got wiped out. She even flipped it on Dan, over $4,000 each month just like that, and the support money kept dwindling until Betty went from a rich lady to someone who was both poor and in debt. It wasn't until fall 1989 that Betty and Dan finally signed the final agreement to end their tumultuous marriage. But the price Betty had to pay. Not only did she lose her home and husband, but she also lost all 4 of her beloved kids, probably because they spent more time with their dad, or maybe it was too much for them to see their mom losing control and screaming in despair. In the end, all 4 chose to live with Dan, leaving Betty alone with her crushing loneliness and anger. Yet just 2 months after the divorce, Dan rushed to throw a lavish wedding with Linda. At that extravagant party, the kids looked stunning, as if this was the best day ever. They seemed like a perfect family, but they had no idea that Betty had a special wedding gift planned for them in the early hours of October 5, 1989. While Dan and Linda were deep in sleep after returning to San Diego from their honeymoon, A series of gunshots erupted in their fancy mansion just a few hours later. Betty called her second daughter, who had moved out. Her voice was calm, almost cold, as she said she just took care of her father and that woman. Then, her daughter broke down, completely panicked. But she still tried to stay calm and urged her mom to turn herself in, while telling her boyfriend to call the cops. When the police arrived at the scene, Linda was confronted with a horrifying sight. TK had been shot in the head and chest. His once shiny blonde hair was now stained a deep red, and his beautiful face was so distorted that she could barely recognize him. Dan had also been shot right in the chest. It seemed like he had been trying to reach for the phone on the nightstand to call for help, but the phone was completely shattered. The chilling precision of each gunshot was haunting. The police couldn't believe that this was the act of a woman who was usually so timid she wouldn't dare even harm a bug. But when she got caught, Betty showed no remorse. She even admitted, "I bought this gun 8 months ago and trained hard with a professional coach. Finally, I can get my revenge." Just 2 days after the incident, Betty celebrated her 34th birthday in jail. When asked about her feelings, she just smirked and said something that left everyone speechless. "If I could turn back time, I'd definitely bring along a bigger magazine to send them off with a few more shots." This line made even the toughest female inmates go pale. Betty, on the other hand, showed no fear and no remorse. She seemed extremely satisfied. The defense attorney decided to use her mental instability as a defense, pulling out records from psychologists to prove that Betty was suffering from severe emotional distress after years of betrayal and mental abuse. In court, Betty changed completely. The statement insists that she had no intention of committing murder. She just wanted to go there to talk about custody rights. She brought a gun to threaten herself, but then Linda came at her, which made her panic and grab some grass. After that, Dan also rushed in, and she could only defend herself. However, the forensic expert immediately dismissed this statement, as ballistic analysis showed that Linda was shot while she was still sleeping. One bullet hit her in the head, killing her instantly. The other bullet was just so Betty could take out her anger. She didn't actually charge at anyone. Betty was really just trying to grab her phone to call for help about the blood at the scene. It also shows that she had been sitting next to the body for a while, witnessing her husband dying. The police found a strand of Betty's shiny blonde hair right by his shoulder. This proves that before she took her last breath, she leaned down and said something to her ex-husband. Whether it was a curse or a regretful question like "Why did I ever love you?" Nobody can say for sure, but even just these details are enough to crushing the arguments. Bet that she just intended to self-destruct and that the shooting was an unfortunate accident. Plus, the police made public a diary they found at Betty's house, and every page is filled with frustration, anger, regrets, and extreme despair. On the last page, she writes, "Since I was little, I've always been taught to be a good girl, but now what? What does a good girl like me do? It's either me or them, there's no third option." But a knife. The hardest part for Betty wasn't the prosecution, it was her own 4 kids. Her second daughter testified in court that just a few weeks before the case, Betty tried to get the house keys back from Dan and kept asking about her dad's and stepmom's schedule. The little girl thought her mom had moved on from the past and wanted to make amends, even preparing a special gift. But that so-called gift ended up being a traumatic memory that would haunt her for life. Her eldest daughter, who was 19 at the time, was even colder about it than she was. Just recounting how Betty kept barging into Dad's house, yelling and threatening to drag the whole family down to hell. And it painted Dad as this gentle guy who really loves his kids. Linda isn't that awful stepmother Mom always talks about. She's actually a kind woman who treats the kids well. With a firm tone, she wrapped up her statement with something that hit Betty right in the gut. "You were the one who destroyed our family, and I'll never forgive you for that." By the end of it, her eyes were finally red. But this woman still insists she's done nothing wrong, and Linda has pushed me to my limit, I was just responding to them. Betty's case quickly became a hot topic of debate. Some people see her as a symbol of feminism, a woman brave enough to stand up against betrayal and injustice. They praise Betty for making cheating men tremble. But there are also plenty of others who view her as a crazy woman, someone who would rather destroy everything than lose. The man's strong arguments led to the first trial ending without a verdict. The male jurors felt it was a premeditated murder deserving the maximum sentence, while some female jurors were sympathetic towards Betty, wanting to conclude that she had acted out of emotional impulse. After 5 days of intense debate, they couldn't reach an agreement, so the court had to take a break. The second trial happened right after, and this time the jury came to a compromise. Betty was sentenced to 2 years. Betty is facing a second-degree murder charge along with an illegal weapons possession charge, which means she's looking at a life sentence with a minimum of 32 years without the possibility of parole. She's tried to get her sentence reduced twice, in 2010 and 2017, but both times she was denied. The reason? The victim's family can't forgive her. Ironically, the victim's family consists of Betty's own biological children. What's even more surprising is that her two daughters, who were once determined to put her in prison, are actually the first ones to forgive her. The youngest son still held on to his anger, saying he would never forget that fateful afternoon years ago when his mother threw him away like trash at the doorstep of Lena's house. At that time, he was just a little boy, begging and clinging to his mother's pants, but Betty coldly pried his hands off and walked away without a second thought. Terrified, he chased after the car as it drove off, running so fast that he lost his shoes, his tiny feet scraped and bleeding. That memory was etched in his mind forever. It makes you understand your mom's situation, but you'll never be able to forgive her. The next time Betty can get parole is in 2032. If she's still alive by then, she'll be an 84-year-old grandma, looking back on her life. Everyone can only sigh and feel regret for Betty, who went from being a little princess spoiled by her parents, a sweet and well-behaved girl in everyone's eyes, to a terrifying angry Betty, a murderer with a twisted face, all because of the hate that ruined her life. Not just a cheating husband and a woman who took her place, but above all, it's a marriage where love and sacrifice were never balanced. She poured her heart out only to receive betrayal and bitterness in return. And that's where today's case wraps up. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to give us a boost for more true crime stories. For now, goodbye, and see you in the next stories. And remember to turn on the notification bell. Don't miss out on any videos. Hey there, see you next time.